The dust-covered stagecoach rattled into Winnemucca, Nevada, on a scorching afternoon in July of 1882, and Marjorie Nelson clutched her fiddle case tighter against her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her heart from leaping out through her ribs. She had traveled 3,000 miles from Boston to marry a man whose face she knew only from a single faded photograph. And now that the moment had arrived, every nerve in her body screamed at her to turn back, to climb right back onto that coach and disappear into the desert. But there was nothing waiting for her in Boston except empty rooms and memories of a family taken too soon by scarlet fever. So she straightened her shoulders, smoothed down her travel-worn dress, and stepped into the dry Nevada heat with her fiddle and her courage as her only companions. The town of Winnemucca sprawled before her in shades of brown and gold, a collection of wooden buildings that looked like they had been thrown together in a hurry and left to weather under the relentless sun. Main Street stretched out in both directions, lined with establishments that bore hand-painted signs advertising everything from dry goods to whiskey. Horses stood tied to hitching posts, their tails swishing at flies, and men in dusty clothes moved about their business with the unhurried pace of people who had learned that nothing good came from rushing in such heat. Marjorie scanned the faces of the few people who had gathered to watch the stagecoach arrive, searching for someone who might be Daniel Harper. Her future husband had described himself in his letters as a rancher with his own spread just outside of town, a man of 30 years who was looking for a partner to share his life on the land. His letters had been kind and thoughtful, filled with descriptions of Nevada's stark beauty and honest about the hardships of frontier life. She had responded with equal honesty about her own situation, her age of 23 years, her lack of family, and her one true passion in life, which was her music. The fiddle had belonged to her father, and before him, his father. It was a beautiful instrument made by a craftsman in Ireland, brought to America when her grandfather had immigrated as a young man. Marjorie had learned to play at her father's knee, and music had always been the language through which her family expressed the things that words could not capture. When she had written to Daniel about bringing her fiddle west, he had replied that he would be honored to have music in his home, that the silence of the prairie sometimes felt like it could swallow a person whole. Miss Nelson. A deep voice cut through her thoughts, and Marjorie turned to find herself looking up at a man who stood at least 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard physical labor and a face weathered by sun and wind. He held his hat in his hands, revealing dark hair that showed threads of silver at the temples, and his eyes were a startling shade of blue against his tanned skin. Those eyes held a mixture of hope and nervousness that probably matched her own expression. "Mr. Harper?" she asked, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. "Daniel," he said quickly. "Please, just Daniel. And I hope you will allow me to call you Marjorie, though I understand if you would prefer to maintain formality until we know each other better." He spoke carefully, as if he had practiced these words during the long wait for the stage to arrive. "Marjorie is fine," she said, managing a small smile. Up close, she could see that the photograph had not done him justice. There was kindness in his face, in the slight crinkles around his eyes and the gentle curve of his mouth. His hands, large and calloused, turned his hat around and around in a gesture that revealed his own nervousness. "Your journey was not too difficult, I hope?" Daniel asked. "I know the stage from Sacramento can be rough going." "It was long," Marjorie admitted, "but I have traveled much farther to get here. A few more days on rough roads hardly seemed to matter at that point." Daniel nodded, then seemed to notice the case she held. "Is that your fiddle? You wrote about it in your letters. I confess I have been looking forward to hearing you play." We do not get much in the way of music out here, except for the occasional piano player at the saloon, and that man knows only 3 songs, 2 of which he plays poorly." Despite herself, Marjorie laughed, and some of the tension in her shoulders eased. "I promise I know more than 3 songs, and I do my best to play all of them well." "I do not doubt it," Daniel said, and his smile transformed his serious face into something warm and genuine. "Now, I have taken rooms for you at the boarding house here in town. I thought you might like a few days to rest from your journey and to decide if you still want to go through with our arrangement. I will not hold you to anything if you find that I am not to your liking." The offer surprised Marjorie. Most of the mail-order bride arrangements she had heard about involved immediate marriages, with little room for second thoughts on either side. "That is very considerate," she said carefully, "though I would say the same applies to you. If I am not what you expected, I will understand." "You are exactly what I expected," Daniel said, and then flushed slightly. "Forgive me, that sounded forward. I only meant that your letters were so honest and true that I feel I already know something of your character. The rest, I hope, we will learn together." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Marjorie took it. His arm was solid and steady beneath her hand, and she felt a flutter of something in her chest that might have been hope. They walked together down Main Street, Daniel carrying her trunk as if it weighed nothing while she kept her fiddle case close. He pointed out the various establishments as they passed: the general store, the telegraph office, the marshal's office, and the church at the far end of town. "Reverend Matthews is a good man," Daniel said as they passed the simple white building with its wooden cross. "When you are ready, he will perform the ceremony. He likes to speak with couples before he marries them, to make sure they understand what they are committing to." "I hope that does not trouble you." "Not at all," Marjorie said. "I think it shows wisdom. Marriage is not something to be entered into lightly." The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Peterson, a widow of 50-some years with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that took in every detail of Marjorie's appearance. But her smile was genuine enough when Daniel made the introductions, and she showed Marjorie to a clean room on the 2nd floor that looked out over the street. "Meals are served 3 times a day in the dining room downstairs," Mrs. Peterson explained. "Breakfast at 7, dinner at noon, and supper at 6. We keep a quiet house, no gentlemen visitors after 8 in the evening, and no drinking or gambling on the premises. You need anything, you come find me." After Mrs. Peterson left, Daniel lingered in the doorway, clearly uncertain about the proper protocol for this situation. "I will be staying at my ranch," he said. "It is about 5 miles from town. I come in most days to handle business and check on things. Perhaps tomorrow, if you are feeling rested, I could show you around town properly. And if you are willing, you could come out to the ranch, see where you would be living." "I would like that," Marjorie said. She set her fiddle case on the bed, and Daniel's eyes followed the movement. "I meant what I said about wanting to hear you play," he told her. "Music is a precious thing out here. It reminds people that there is more to life than just surviving day to day." After Daniel left, Marjorie sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself to simply breathe for the first time in what felt like days. The room was plain but clean, with a washstand in the corner and a small mirror on the wall. She looked at her reflection and barely recognized herself. The journey had left her face thinner, her eyes larger, and there was a wariness in her expression that had not been there when she left Boston. She opened her fiddle case and ran her fingers over the smooth wood of the instrument. It needed tuning after the journey, but otherwise, it had survived the trip intact. She tightened the bow and spent a few minutes adjusting the strings until the notes rang clear and true. Then, without really thinking about it, she began to play. The melody that flowed from beneath her fingers was an old Irish air her father had taught her, a tune about leaving home and seeking new horizons. The notes filled the small room and spilled out through the open window into the street below. She played with her eyes closed, letting the music carry away some of the fear and uncertainty that had been her constant companions for so long. When she finally lowered the bow, she heard applause from the street. Opening her eyes, she looked out the window to find a small crowd had gathered below, drawn by the music. They were smiling up at her, and one man called out, "Play another, miss." Marjorie felt her cheeks heat, but she smiled and obliged with a livelier tune, a reel that had people tapping their feet and swaying in the dusty street. When she finished, the applause was even louder, and she noticed Daniel standing at the edge of the crowd, his hat back on his head and his face alight with pleasure. That night, Marjorie lay in bed and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the frontier town settling in for the night. Somewhere a dog barked, a horse whinnied. Voices drifted up from the saloon down the street, and once she heard what might have been gunshots in the distance, though they were too far away to be threatening. She thought about Daniel Harper, about the kind eyes and nervous hands and the careful way he spoke. She thought about the ranch she had not yet seen and the life she was committing to in this harsh, beautiful land. And she thought about music, about how it had drawn people together in the street today, how it had made them smile and forget for a moment about the hardships of their lives. That, she realized, was what she could bring to this place. Not just herself as a wife and partner, but the gift of music to break the silence that Daniel had written about, the silence that could swallow a person whole. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with a heat that was already building by the time Marjorie came down for breakfast. The dining room held several other boarders, mostly men who worked in town at various trades, and they all nodded politely to her as she took a seat. Mrs. Peterson brought out platters of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, and Marjorie ate with better appetite than she had managed in days. Daniel arrived promptly at 9, looking freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt. "Good morning," he said, and Marjorie noticed that his hair was still damp, as if he had dunked his whole head in a water trough. The thought made her want to smile. "Are you ready for a tour of our little town?" "Very ready," she assured him, and they set out into the morning heat. Winnemucca, Daniel explained as they walked, had started as a trading post and had grown along with the railroad. The town served the surrounding ranches and the few mining operations that still operated in the nearby hills. It was not a large place, perhaps 500 souls on a busy day, but it had most of the necessities of civilization and a few of the comforts. He showed her the general store first, introducing her to the proprietor, a man named Bill Sanders who had a ready smile and an apparently endless supply of stories about the early days of the town. The store smelled of coffee and leather, and a dozen other things Marjorie could not quite identify. The shelves were stocked with everything from canned goods to farming equipment, and there was even a small section devoted to fabric and sewing notions. "We get a shipment every month from Sacramento," Bill explained. "If there is something specific you need that I do not stock, I can usually order it in. Might take a few weeks to arrive, but I do my best to keep folks supplied." From there, they visited the post office, where Daniel introduced her to the postmaster, and then the bank, where Daniel clearly had good standing based on the warm greeting he received. Everywhere they went, people were friendly but curious, their eyes moving between Marjorie and Daniel with open speculation. Small towns, Marjorie knew, thrived on gossip, and a mail-order bride was bound to be the subject of much discussion. "Does the attention bother you?" Daniel asked quietly as they walked toward the edge of town. "I expected it," Marjorie said honestly. "I imagine I am the most interesting thing to happen in Winnemucca in some time." "Not the most interesting," Daniel said. "Last month, a prospector claimed he had found gold up in the hills, and half the town went running after him. Turned out to be nothing but fool's gold and wishful thinking. That caused quite a stir." Marjorie laughed, and Daniel smiled at the sound. They had reached the church, and Reverend Matthews was working in the small garden beside the building, tending to vegetables that somehow managed to grow in the harsh climate. "Daniel," the Reverend called out, straightening up and wiping his hands on his trousers. He was a man of middle years with a weathered face and kind eyes. "And this must be Miss Nelson. Welcome to Winnemucca." "Thank you, Reverend," Marjorie said. "Daniel tells me you two are planning to marry once you have had time to become acquainted," Reverend Matthews said. "I think that shows good sense. I would be happy to speak with you both before the ceremony, help you think through what you are committing to. Marriage is a sacred bond, not something to be entered into without thought and prayer." They talked for a while in the shade of the church, and Marjorie found herself liking the Reverend's straightforward manner. He did not try to romanticize the difficulties of frontier life or marriage, but neither did he paint everything in dark colors. He spoke of partnership and commitment, of working together through hard times and celebrating together in good times. When they left the church, Daniel asked, "Would you like to see the ranch now? It is a bit of a ride, but I brought the wagon so it should not be too uncomfortable." "I would very much like to see it," Marjorie said. The wagon was waiting at the livery stable, hitched to two sturdy horses. Daniel helped Marjorie up onto the bench seat, and then they were rolling out of town, heading west across land that stretched out in all directions under the vast blue sky. The landscape was unlike anything Marjorie had seen before. Where Boston had been all trees and buildings and crowded streets, Nevada was open space and distant mountains and earth the color of rust and gold. "It takes some getting used to," Daniel said, watching her face. "The emptiness. But after a while, you start to see that it is not really empty at all. There is life everywhere if you know how to look for it." As they traveled, he pointed out various features of the land. The line of cottonwoods that marked a creek, the distant shapes of pronghorn antelope, the circling silhouette of a hawk riding the thermals. He spoke about his ranch, which he had built up over the past 8 years from nothing. He ran cattle and horses, kept a large garden, and had just finished building a new barn before he started corresponding with potential brides. "Why did you decide to look for a wife through letters?" Marjorie asked. "Surely there are women here in Nevada who would have been interested." Daniel was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a deep rut in the trail. "There are not many single women in these parts," he said finally. "And those who are here, well, we have known each other for years, and there was never any spark between us. I wanted a fresh start with someone who was choosing this life deliberately, not just settling because there were no other options. And I suppose I wanted someone who understood what it meant to leave everything behind and start over, because that is what I did when I came here from Missouri." "What made you leave Missouri?" Marjorie asked. "My father and I did not see eye to eye on most things," Daniel said, his voice careful. "He had plans for me that did not match what I wanted for my own life. After my mother died, there was nothing keeping me there, so I headed west to make my own way. I worked as a ranch hand for several years, saved every penny, and eventually had enough to buy my own land and stock it with cattle." There was more to the story, Marjorie suspected, but she did not push. They were still learning each other, still figuring out what could be shared and what needed more time. The ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, and Marjorie felt her breath catch. It was not grand by any means, just a collection of buildings clustered around a natural spring. but there was something appealing about the way it sat in the landscape, as if it had grown there rather than been built. The main house was constructed of wood with a covered porch that faced east, probably to catch the morning sun. A barn stood nearby, its red paint still fresh, and there were several corrals and a chicken coop and what looked like a smokehouse. "It is not much," Daniel said, and Marjorie could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "But it is solid and it is mine, paid for free and clear. I have water from the spring year-round and good grazing land. I run about 200 head of cattle and a dozen horses. I have 2 hired men who help with the heavy work, but they bunk in town and only come out during the day." "It is beautiful," Marjorie said honestly. "I was not expecting beautiful, but it is." Daniel's face lit up with relief and pride. He helped her down from the wagon and showed her around with the eagerness of a man displaying his life's work. The house had 4 rooms, a main room that served as kitchen and living space, 2 bedrooms, and a small room that Daniel said could be used for whatever she wished. It was simply furnished but clean, with wide windows that let in plenty of light and a stone fireplace that would provide heat in the winter. "I am not much of a cook," Daniel admitted. "I can manage basic meals, but nothing fancy. I was hoping you might have some skill in that area." "I can cook," Marjorie assured him. "Nothing elaborate, but good, solid food. My mother made sure I learned the basics before she died." They walked out to the barn, where Daniel showed her his horses with obvious affection. He had a gift with animals, that much was clear. The horses came to him readily, nuzzling his hands and nickering softly. He introduced each one by name and personality, and Marjorie found herself charmed by the way he spoke to them as if they were old friends. "I was thinking," Daniel said as they stood in the cool dimness of the barn, "that if you decided to stay to marry me, we could have the wedding here at the ranch rather than in town. We could set up in the yard and folks could come out. It would be more private, more personal. But only if that appeals to you. I will do whatever would make you most comfortable." "A wedding here sounds lovely," Marjorie said. "Much better than being on display in town with everyone watching." "I was hoping you would say that," Daniel said, and his smile was so genuine, so hopeful, that Marjorie felt something warm unfold in her chest. He was a good man. She was increasingly certain of that. A kind man who treated his animals well and spoke carefully, and had built something solid out of nothing but hard work and determination. They had lunch sitting on the porch, simple fare of bread and cheese and cold water from the spring that tasted sweet and clean. Daniel talked about his plans for the ranch, about wanting to expand the herd and maybe start breeding horses seriously. He asked about her life in Boston, and Marjorie found herself telling him about her family, about the music that had filled their small house, and about the terrible swift way that scarlet fever had taken them all within the space of 3 weeks. "I am sorry," Daniel said quietly. "That is a grief too large for words." "It was," Marjorie agreed. "For a long time I thought I might drown in it, but then I realized that staying in Boston, surrounded by memories, was slowly killing me in a different way. I needed to go somewhere new, somewhere that was not haunted by all that loss." "And you chose to come here to marry a stranger," Daniel said. "That took courage, or desperation," Marjorie said with a small smile. "I am not sure yet which it was. Perhaps both," Daniel suggested. Courage and desperation often travel together. On the ride back to town, Marjorie felt more settled than she had since leaving Boston. The ranch was real now, not just words in a letter, and Daniel was proving to be exactly the kind of man his letters had suggested. Steady, honest, and genuinely kind. She could see a life here, could imagine herself in that simple house, cooking meals and tending a garden and playing her fiddle on the porch in the evenings. That night, after supper at the boarding house, Marjorie took her fiddle down to the small parlor that Mrs. Peterson made available to the guests. Several of the other boarders gathered to listen, and soon word spread, and more people came in from the street. Marjorie played for nearly 2 hours, working through her repertoire of reels and jigs and ballads and popular songs from back east. The audience was appreciative, clapping and sometimes singing along when they knew the words. Daniel arrived halfway through her impromptu concert and stood at the back of the room, watching her with an expression that made Marjorie's fingers falter on the strings for just a moment. There was something in his eyes, a warmth and admiration that sent a flutter through her stomach. When she finished playing and the crowd dispersed, he approached her carefully. "That was remarkable," he said. "I have never heard anyone play like that. You make the fiddle sing." "Thank you," Marjorie said, feeling herself flush at the praise. "It is good to play for people again. In Boston, toward the end, I could barely stand to touch the fiddle. It reminded me too much of my father, of all that I had lost. But here, it feels different. It feels like I can make something new with it." "I am glad," Daniel said. He hesitated, then asked, "Marjorie, I know we have only just met in person, but I find myself very certain about this, about us. Would you be willing to set a date for the wedding? I do not want to rush you, but I also do not want to pretend that I need weeks of courtship to know that you are exactly who I hoped you would be." Marjorie looked at him, at this earnest, kind man who stood before her with his hat in his hands and hope in his eyes. She thought about the ranch and the music and the way her heart had lifted when she saw him smile. She thought about fresh starts and new beginnings and the possibility of building something good out of the wreckage of her old life. 2 weeks, she said. "Let us plan the wedding for 2 weeks from today. That will give me time to make sure I have everything I need, and it will give us a bit more time to become acquainted. But yes, Daniel, I am willing to marry you." The smile that broke across Daniel's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He reached for her hand, and when she gave it to him, he held it gently, as if it were something precious. "You have made me very happy," he said. "I will do everything in my power to make sure you never regret this decision." The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Marjorie spent her days preparing for the wedding and her new life. She visited the general store and purchased fabric to make a new dress, something simpler than the elaborate gowns she had worn in Boston, but still pretty enough for a wedding. She bought supplies for the household and spent time learning the layout of Winnemucca and meeting the people who would be her neighbors. Daniel came to town every day, and they spent hours together, walking and talking and learning each other's habits and preferences. He taught her to ride one of his gentler horses, and though she was inexperienced and nervous at first, she found that she enjoyed the feeling of movement and freedom that came with riding across the open land. He took her fishing in a creek that ran through his property, and she laughed at his patience with the task, at the way he could sit perfectly still for long stretches, content to wait for the fish to bite. In the evenings, Marjorie played her fiddle, sometimes in the boarding house parlor and sometimes on the porch, where her music drifted out into the night. People began to gather regularly to listen, and she found herself learning what songs were popular in this part of the country, what tunes made people smile or tap their feet or get up and dance. One evening, about a week before the wedding, Daniel brought his own surprise to share. He pulled a harmonica from his pocket and asked, "Do you think you could teach me to play along with you? I have had this for years but never got much beyond a few simple tunes." They spent that evening and several more working on playing together, and though Daniel was far from expert, there was something wonderful about making music with another person, about the way their sounds blended and created something larger than either of them could produce alone. They laughed at his mistakes and celebrated when he got a passage right. And Marjorie realized with a start that she was happy, truly happy, for the first time since she had lost her family. Reverend Matthews met with them several times to discuss marriage and their expectations for their life together. He asked hard questions about how they would handle disagreements about their faith, about children and finances, and all the practical matters that romantic notions often overlooked. Marjorie appreciated his thoroughness, and she could see that Daniel did as well. They were both people who valued honesty and clear communication, and the Reverend's questions helped them have conversations they might not have thought to have on their own. "I do not expect perfection," Daniel told her during one of these conversations. "I know there will be hard times and disagreements, but I believe that if we face things together with honesty and respect, we can work through whatever comes." "I believe that too," Marjorie agreed. "And I promise to always be honest with you, even when the truth is difficult. My father used to say that lies were like poison, that they killed trust slowly but surely." The day before the wedding, Marjorie woke with butterflies dancing in her stomach. Mrs. Peterson had offered to help her prepare, and several of the other women in town had offered their assistance as well. It touched Marjorie that these people who barely knew her were willing to help make her wedding day special. She spent the morning finishing the last details on her dress, a simple gown of pale blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs. It was nothing like the elaborate silk and satin creations that had been fashionable in Boston, but it suited her new life, and when she tried it on, she felt pretty in a way she had not felt in a long time. That afternoon, Daniel came to town one last time before the wedding. They walked out to the edge of town, to a small rise that offered a view of the surrounding landscape. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Are you nervous?" Daniel asked. "Terrified," Marjorie admitted. "But in a good way, if that makes any sense. I am scared of all the unknowns, but I am also excited. I feel like I am standing on the edge of something important, something that could be very good if we are both willing to work for it." "I feel the same," Daniel said. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. They had held hands several times over the past 2 weeks, but it still sent a small thrill through her whenever he touched her. "Marjorie, I want you to know that I already care for you deeply. I know it has only been a short time, but everything about you, your kindness, your courage, your music, all of it has worked its way into my heart. I am not expecting you to feel the same way yet, but I hope that in time you might come to care for me as well." Marjorie squeezed his hand. "I already do care for you," she said softly. "I did not expect it to happen so quickly, but it has. When I think about the future now, I cannot imagine it without you in it. That is how I know this is right." Daniel turned to face her fully, and for a moment Marjorie thought he might kiss her. But instead he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, an old-fashioned gesture that made her heart flutter. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will be my wife and I will be your husband. And I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the gift you are giving me by choosing this life, by choosing me." The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, with a slight breeze that offered relief from the usual heat. Daniel and his 2 hired hands had spent the previous day preparing the ranch, setting up chairs borrowed from the church, and decorating the yard with wildflowers gathered from the surrounding hills. It was simple but lovely, and when Marjorie arrived in the wagon with Mrs. Peterson and several other women from town, she felt tears prick her eyes at the sight. Daniel stood near the porch, dressed in his best clothes, his dark hair slicked back and his face clean-shaven. He looked handsome and nervous and completely earnest, and when his eyes met hers, The smile that broke across his face made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony with warmth and sincerity, speaking about the sacred nature of marriage and the commitment they were making to each other. When it came time for the vows, Daniel's voice was strong and clear as he promised to love and honor her, to stand by her in good times and bad, to be a faithful husband and partner. Marjorie's voice shook slightly as she made her own promises, but she meant every word with her whole heart. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that took her breath away. It was her first real kiss, and it was everything she had hoped it would be, sweet and gentle and full of promise. The celebration that followed was joyful and lively. People had brought food to share, and tables were laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, vegetables from various gardens, and desserts of every description. Someone had brought a guitar, and combined with Marjorie's fiddle, they had music for dancing. The yard filled with couples swaying and twirling, and laughter rang out under the vast Nevada sky. As the sun began to set, painting everything in golden light, Daniel found Marjorie standing slightly apart from the crowd, watching the celebration with a smile on her face. He came up beside her and said, "People will start heading back to town soon, but before they do, would you play something?" Our wedding song, Marjorie asked, surprised. "We did not discuss a wedding song." "I know," Daniel said, looking slightly embarrassed. "But when you were playing the other night, you played this one tune, a waltz, I think. It was so beautiful, so full of longing and hope at the same time. I thought it would be perfect for us for this moment." Marjorie knew immediately which tune he meant. It was a waltz her father had taught her, a melody that spoke of love found after long searching, of two hearts finding their home in each other. "Yes," she said softly, "I can play that. I will play that for us." She retrieved her fiddle and Daniel called for everyone's attention. "My wife," he said, and Marjorie felt a thrill at hearing him call her that, "is going to play our wedding song. And I am going to attempt to dance with her, though I should warn everyone that I am not particularly graceful." The crowd laughed and cleared a space in the yard. Marjorie lifted her fiddle to her shoulder and began to play. The melody flowed sweet and clear into the evening air, and Daniel took her hand, placing his other hand carefully at her waist. They began to move together, and though he had been right about not being a graceful dancer, it did not matter at all. They moved together, finding their rhythm, and Marjorie played with her eyes on his face, watching the way the setting sun caught in his eyes and turned them to sapphire. Around them, other couples joined in the dance, and the yard became a swirl of movement and music and joy. Marjorie had never played and danced at the same time before, but somehow she managed, her fingers finding the notes while her feet followed Daniel's lead. It was awkward and imperfect and absolutely perfect all at once. When the song ended, Daniel pulled her close and whispered, "Thank you for the music, for this day, for saying yes. Thank you for all of it." Marjorie rested her head against his chest for just a moment, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you for writing those letters," she whispered back, "for giving me a reason to be brave." Eventually, the guests began the journey back to town, calling out well wishes and congratulations. Mrs. Peterson gave Marjorie a warm hug and told her to come visit anytime she needed company or advice. Reverend Matthews shook Daniel's hand and told them both that they had his prayers for a long and happy marriage. When the last wagon had disappeared into the gathering darkness, Daniel and Marjorie stood together in the yard, surrounded by the debris of the celebration and the soft sounds of the night. The stars were beginning to emerge overhead, more stars than Marjorie had ever seen in Boston, where city lights washed out the sky. "Ready to see your home?" Daniel asked, offering his arm. "Our home," Marjorie corrected gently, and Daniel's smile was radiant. He led her into the house, which looked different than it had on her previous visits. Someone, probably Mrs. Peterson and her helpers, had arranged flowers in jars on the table and mantel. The bedroom had fresh linens on the bed, and everything was spotlessly clean. It was clear that people had worked hard to make this place welcoming for her. They stood in the main room, suddenly awkward with each other now that they were alone and married. Daniel cleared his throat and said, "I want you to feel comfortable here. This is your home now, and you can arrange things however you like. And I want you to know that I will never pressure you about marital relations. We can take things slowly, get used to each other." Marjorie felt a rush of affection for this careful, considerate man. "I appreciate that," she said. "Though I hope you know that I do want to be a true wife to you. I am just nervous because everything is so new." "We are both nervous," Daniel said with a small smile. "We will figure it out together." That first night, they lay together in the darkness, not making love but simply holding each other, talking in whispers about their hopes and fears and dreams. Daniel told her about his childhood in Missouri, about a father who had been hard and demanding, about a mother who had tried to soften his father's harshness, but who had died when Daniel was only 16. Marjorie talked about her family, about the music that had bound them together, about the emptiness that had followed their deaths. "I am glad we found each other," Daniel said as sleep began to pull them under. "In this vast country, in this big world, somehow we found each other." "Me too," Marjorie whispered. "Me too." The days that followed established the rhythms of their new life together. Marjorie woke before dawn with Daniel, cooked breakfast while he tended to the animals, and then spent her mornings working on the endless tasks that kept a ranch running. Cooking, cleaning, tending the garden, preserving food, mending clothes. It was hard work, much harder than anything she had done in Boston, but there was something satisfying about seeing the direct results of her labor. In the afternoons, after the worst of the heat had passed, Daniel taught her more about ranch work. She learned to milk the cow, to gather eggs from the temperamental hens, to recognize when a horse was favoring a leg or when cattle were showing signs of illness. He was a patient teacher, never making her feel foolish for not knowing things that were second nature to him. And in the evenings, there was music. Marjorie played her fiddle while Daniel listened, or sometimes they played together, her fiddle and his harmonica creating simple but beautiful harmonies. On weekends, people from town would sometimes ride out to the ranch, drawn by word of the music, and they would have impromptu gatherings that lasted late into the night. Slowly, cautiously, Marjorie and Daniel grew into their marriage. The awkwardness faded as they learned each other's bodies and desires. Daniel was gentle and attentive, always making sure she was comfortable, and Marjorie discovered that the physical side of marriage could be a source of deep pleasure and connection. They became not just husband and wife but true partners, sharing the work and the decisions and the small joys of daily life. 3 months after the wedding, Marjorie woke feeling queasy and tired. She tried to push through it, but when the smell of coffee made her rush outside to be sick, Daniel followed her with concern written all over his face. "Are you ill?" he asked, helping her back into the house. "Should I ride for the doctor?" "I do not think I am ill," Marjorie said slowly, a suspicion forming in her mind. "I think I might be with child." Daniel froze, his eyes going wide. "Truly, you think so?" "I am not certain," Marjorie said, "but the signs seem to point that way. My monthly courses have not come, and I have been feeling strange for the past week or so." Daniel's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, joy, fear, and then a fierce protectiveness. "You should rest," he said. "Let me handle everything today, you just rest." Marjorie laughed at his sudden intensity. "I am pregnant, not dying. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." "Not my wife," Daniel said stubbornly. "My wife is going to take care of herself and not take any chances." A visit to the doctor in town confirmed what Marjorie had suspected. She was indeed pregnant, with the baby expected to arrive in early summer. Daniel was beside himself with joy and worry in equal measure. He fussed over her constantly, trying to keep her from doing any heavy work, until Marjorie finally had to sit him down and explain that she was perfectly capable of managing her normal tasks, at least for now. Winter came to Nevada, bringing cold winds and occasional snow. The ranch work became harder, and there were days when Daniel came in half frozen from checking on the cattle. Marjorie made sure there was always hot food and a warm fire waiting, and in the evenings, they would sit together with her fiddle, playing soft melodies while the wind howled outside. On Christmas Eve, they invited several neighbors and friends from town to the ranch for a celebration. Marjorie cooked for days in preparation, and the house filled with the smells of roasting meat and baking bread and spiced cider. When their guests arrived, the house came alive with conversation and laughter. Marjorie played Christmas carols and everyone sang along, their voices rising in harmony. At one point, Daniel stood up and raised his cup. "I want to propose a toast," he said. "To my wife, Marjorie, who brought music and light into my life. To the child we are expecting, who will hopefully inherit her mother's talent. And to all of you, our friends and neighbors, who have welcomed us and supported us. May we all have many more years together in this beautiful, hard, wonderful land." "Hear, hear," the guests chorused, raising their own cups. Later, when everyone had gone home and they were cleaning up the remains of the party, Daniel pulled Marjorie into his arms. "I love you," he said, the first time he had spoken those words so directly. "I have loved you since that day you arrived on the stage with your fiddle and your courage. I love the way you play music. I love the way you laugh. I love your kindness and your strength. I love everything about you." Marjorie felt tears sting her eyes. "I love you too," she said. "I did not think I could ever be this happy again after losing my family, but you have given me a new family, a new life. You have given me everything." They stood there in the warm kitchen, holding each other while the fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind sang its lonely song outside. Marjorie thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the fear and grief that had driven her west, about the leap of faith she had taken when she stepped off that stage with nothing but her fiddle and her hope. The winter passed slowly, with Daniel becoming increasingly protective as Marjorie's pregnancy advanced. She continued to play her fiddle, though she had to adjust her position as her belly grew. The baby seemed to respond to the music, moving and kicking when she played lively tunes, settling peacefully when she played lullabies. Spring arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the range island. The cattle grew fat on new grass, and Daniel's horses produced several foals that he was particularly proud of. Marjorie spent hours watching the young animals play in the corrals, thinking about the child who would soon join them. In late May, on a warm evening when the sky was painted in shades of rose and gold, Marjorie's labor began. Daniel rode for the doctor and for Mrs. Peterson, who had experience with births, and then spent the next 12 hours pacing and praying while the women worked in the bedroom. When the baby's first cry finally rang out, Daniel burst into the room despite Mrs. Peterson's protests about propriety. Marjorie lay exhausted in the bed, her hair damp with sweat, but her face was radiant as she held a small bundle wrapped in blankets. "A son," she said softly as Daniel approached. "We have a son." Daniel looked down at the tiny red face of his child and felt something shift in his chest, a love so fierce and immediate that it almost frightened him. "He is perfect," he breathed. "You are perfect, both of you." They named him Matthew Daniel Harper, after Marjorie's father and Daniel himself. Little Matthew was a healthy baby with a strong set of lungs that he was not afraid to use, especially in the middle of the night. Those early weeks were exhausting, with Marjorie recovering from the birth while caring for a demanding infant. But Daniel helped as much as he could, walking the floor with Matthew when he cried, changing diapers, and handling all the household tasks so Marjorie could focus on the baby. One evening, about a month after Matthew's birth, Daniel came in from the barn to find Marjorie sitting in the rocking chair, nursing the baby while humming softly. The sight stopped him in his tracks, and he stood in the doorway just watching them, his wife and his son, and felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the life he had been given. "What are you staring at?" Marjorie asked with a smile, noticing him. "My family," Daniel said simply. "I am staring at my family." As Matthew grew, the house filled with new sounds, baby gurgles and cries, and eventually laughter and babbling. Marjorie sang to him constantly and played her fiddle whenever he was awake. It seemed that he had indeed inherited something of her musical nature, because he would quiet immediately when she played, his eyes wide and focused on the source of the sound. When Matthew was 6 months old, Marjorie began teaching him to clap along with simple rhythms. By the time he was a year old, he could pat his hands on the floor in time with her playing, and his face would light up with joy whenever she brought out the fiddle. Life on the ranch fell into comfortable patterns. Daniel's cattle business thrived, and he was able to hire more help, which meant he could spend more time with Marjorie and Matthew. They made regular trips into Winnemucca, where Marjorie had become something of a local celebrity for her musical talent. She played at church services, at weddings and dances, and at community gatherings, and Daniel would watch her with pride, knowing that her gift brought joy to so many people. On their second wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised Marjorie by presenting her with a beautiful wooden music stand that he had commissioned from a carpenter in town. It was carved with intricate designs of musical notes and flowers, and it could be adjusted to different heights. "I wanted you to have something special," Daniel said as she ran her fingers over the smooth wood. "To thank you for all the music you have brought into my life, into all our lives." "It is beautiful," Marjorie said, tears in her eyes, "but you know you do not need to thank me for the music. Playing brings me as much joy as it brings anyone listening." "I know," Daniel said, "but I wanted you to have something that shows how much I appreciate you, how much I love you. These 2 years have been the happiest of my life." "Mine too," Marjorie said, reaching up to kiss him. "Even with all the hard work and the sleepless nights with Matthew, these have been the happiest years I have known." That evening, after Matthew had been put to bed, they sat on the porch together watching the sun set over the distant mountains. Marjorie had her fiddle and Daniel had his harmonica, and they played together, their music floating out across the rangeland. It was the same waltz they had danced to at their wedding, and as they played, Daniel stood and offered his hand. "May I have this dance?" he asked formally. Marjorie set down her fiddle and took his hand. They moved together in the fading light, no longer awkward but perfectly in sync. Two people who had learned each other's rhythms and movements, who had become truly one through love and commitment, and daily choosing to build a life together. When the dance ended, Daniel pulled her close and said, "Do you ever regret it? Coming all this way, marrying a stranger, giving up your old life?" "Never," Marjorie said without hesitation. Not for a single moment. That old life was dead anyway, killed by grief. You gave me a new life, a new reason to make music. You gave me love and a family and a home. How could I ever regret that? The years continued to unfold in their gentle progression. Matthew grew into a bright, energetic boy who was fascinated by both ranch work and music. By the age of 3, he was following Daniel around, trying to help with every task, and he also insisted on having his own fiddle, which was actually a stick with strings tied to it that he would play while his mother played her real instrument. When Matthew was 4, Marjorie discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because she was just stronger and more settled into ranch life. Daniel was no less protective, but had learned to balance his concern with respect for Marjorie's capabilities. Their second child, a daughter they named Mary Elizabeth, arrived on a cool October morning. She had Marjorie's dark hair and Daniel's blue eyes, and from the beginning, she was a calmer baby than Matthew had been. She seemed content to watch the world around her with solemn, thoughtful eyes. Matthew was fascinated by his new sister and wanted to help with everything. He would bring diapers when asked, would gently pat her head, and would sing to her in his high, slightly off-key voice. Watching him with Mary, seeing the tender care he took with her, made Marjorie's heart swell with love and pride. The ranch continued to prosper. Daniel expanded his operations, adding more cattle and breeding some of the finest horses in the region. He gained a reputation as a fair dealer and a knowledgeable rancher, and people sought his advice on everything from animal husbandry to land management. Marjorie's role on the ranch evolved as well. She was not just the rancher's wife, but a full partner in the enterprise. She kept the books, managed the household accounts, and made decisions about purchasing and planning alongside Daniel. And she continued to bring music not just to their home but to the entire community. Her concerts in town were regular events that people looked forward to, and she began teaching several children in the area to play fiddle, passing on the gift her father had given her. One afternoon, when Matthew was 7 and Mary was 3, Marjorie was teaching Matthew a new tune on a small fiddle that Daniel had commissioned for him. His fingers were still clumsy on the strings, and the notes came out scratchy and uneven, but his determination was fierce. He practiced the same passage over and over, refusing to give up even when he grew frustrated. "That is enough for today," Marjorie finally said, seeing the exhaustion in his young face. "You have worked hard. The music will still be there tomorrow." "But I want to get it right," Matthew said, his jaw set stubbornly in an expression that was pure Daniel. "And you will," Marjorie assured him. "But mastery comes with time and practice. You cannot force it to happen all at once." Matthew reluctantly put down his fiddle and Marjorie pulled him into a hug. "I am proud of you," she told him. "Not because you play perfectly, but because you keep trying. That is what really matters." That evening, the whole family gathered on the porch as they did most evenings when weather permitted. Daniel whittled a piece of wood, slowly shaping it into a toy horse for Mary. Marjorie played her fiddle while Matthew practiced his fingering silently on his own instrument, and Mary played with her dolls, humming along with her mother's music. Looking at her family, at this life they had built together in the harsh beauty of Nevada, Marjorie felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. She thought about that scared young woman who had stepped off the stage 4 years ago, clutching a fiddle case and hoping she was making the right choice. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything would be all right, that she would find not just safety but love, not just survival but joy. When Matthew was 10 and Mary was 6, Daniel decided it was time to expand the house. He wanted to add more bedrooms and a proper parlor where Marjorie could teach music lessons and where they could host gatherings without everyone being crammed into the main room. He hired carpenters from town, and for several months, the ranch echoed with the sounds of sawing and hammering. The finished addition transformed the house. The new parlor had large windows that let in abundant light, and Daniel installed shelves for sheet music and a special stand for Marjorie's fiddle when it was not in use. The extra bedrooms meant that Matthew and Mary each had their own space, though Mary often still insisted on sleeping in her brother's room when thunderstorms rolled through. To celebrate the completion of the house, they hosted a large gathering, inviting everyone from town and all their neighbors from the surrounding ranches. Marjorie organized the whole thing with the help of Mrs. Peterson, who was now in her 60s but still sharp as a tack. They cooked for days, preparing enough food to feed an army. The celebration lasted from afternoon until well past dark. There was dancing in the yard, with Marjorie playing fiddle while several other musicians from town joined in on guitars, and a borrowed piano that had been hauled out from town on a wagon. Children ran everywhere, including Matthew and Mary, who were wild with the excitement of having so many people at their home. At one point, Daniel found Marjorie taking a brief rest, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of water. He sat down beside her and took her hand. "Happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Marjorie said. "Sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe this is real, that this is my life." "It is real," Daniel said, squeezing her hand, "and it is good. We have built something good here, you and I." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their children play with the other kids. Then Daniel said, "Do you ever think about having more children?" Marjorie looked at him in surprise. "Do you want more children?" "I think I would like one more," Daniel admitted, "if you are willing. I love watching you with Matthew and Mary, seeing the way you guide them and teach them. And I love being a father, but only if you want it too. I know how hard pregnancy and childbirth are." Marjorie considered his words. She was 31 now, still young enough to have more children, and the truth was that she had been thinking the same thing lately. "Yes," she said finally, "I think I would like one more child, to round out our family." Daniel's face lit up, and he pulled her into a kiss right there on the porch steps, not caring who might see. "I love you," he said. "Thank you for this life, for these children, for everything." Their third child, another son they named James Michael, arrived the following spring when Marjorie was 32. The birth was harder than the previous two, leaving Marjorie exhausted and weak for several weeks afterward. Daniel took over everything, managing the ranch and the household and caring for all three children with the help of a neighbor woman who came in daily to assist. Slowly, Marjorie recovered her strength, and life gradually returned to normal. James was a happy baby who rarely cried and who seemed fascinated by everything around him. Matthew and Mary adored their new brother, fighting over who got to hold him or help feed him. As the children grew, the house filled with the sounds of music and laughter and the constant activity of three energetic youngsters. Matthew showed real talent on the fiddle and practiced diligently, eventually becoming skilled enough to play alongside his mother at community gatherings. Mary preferred singing to playing instruments, and she had a voice that was pure and sweet and could bring tears to people's eyes when she sang hymns at church. James, it turned out, was fascinated by the harmonica. When he was 5, Daniel gave him his old harmonica and showed him a few basic techniques. Within weeks, James was playing simple melodies, and he would follow Matthew and Marjorie around, trying to join in whenever they practiced. The ranch continued to thrive under Daniel's skilled management. He had become one of the most successful ranchers in the region, known for the quality of his cattle and horses. But he never let success change him. He remained the same careful, kind man he had always been, generous with his neighbors and fair in all his dealings. Marjorie continued her music teaching, and over the years, she taught dozens of children to play. Some showed real talent and went on to play professionally. Others just learned enough to enjoy making music for themselves and their families. But all of them remembered Mrs. Harper as a patient, encouraging teacher who had shared her gift freely. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised Marjorie by announcing that he had arranged for all 3 children to spend the night with neighbors. "I want one whole day and night with just you," he said. "No children, no ranch business, no obligations. Just us." They spent the day riding out to their favorite spot, a meadow high in the hills where wildflowers grew in riotous profusion and a small stream burbled over rocks. They had not been there in years, not since before Matthew was born, and being there again felt like returning to the beginning of their story. They spread a blanket and ate the picnic lunch Marjorie had packed. They talked about everything and nothing, reminiscing about their early days together and marveling at how fast the years had flown. Daniel told her about his dreams for the ranch, about wanting to set aside land for each of the children so they could build their own lives if they chose to stay in the area. Marjorie talked about her music students, about the joy of seeing children discover the magic of making music. As the sun began to set, Marjorie unpacked her fiddle. "I brought it because I wanted to play you something," she said. "A new song I have been working on. I call it Daniel's Song." She began to play, and the melody that flowed from beneath her fingers was everything they had been to each other. The hope and fear of their beginning, the growing love, the joy of their children, the contentment of their partnership, and underneath it all, a deep, abiding gratitude. Daniel listened with tears streaming down his face, not bothering to hide his emotion. When she finished, he pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "You are beautiful. Inside and out, you are the most beautiful person I have ever known." "You brought out the best in me," Marjorie said. "You gave me a safe place to heal and grow. You gave me a reason to make music again." They made love there in the meadow as the stars began to emerge overhead. 2 people who had grown from strangers to lovers to partners to soulmates over 15 years of shared life. And afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the night sounds and feeling completely at peace. The years continued their steady march forward. Matthew grew into a tall, serious young man who had his father's way with animals and his mother's musical talent. At 19, he announced that he wanted to start his own ranch on the land Daniel had set aside for him. Daniel helped him build a house and stock it with cattle from the family herd, and Matthew threw himself into the work with the same determination he had brought to learning the fiddle. Mary, at 15, was turning into a beautiful young woman with her mother's grace and her father's steady disposition. She had 3 young men from nearby ranches courting her, though she seemed in no hurry to choose among them. She helped Marjorie with the music lessons and sang at every church service and community gathering. James, at 11, was the adventurer of the family, always exploring and getting into minor scrapes. He had recently announced that he wanted to be a horse trainer like his father, and Daniel had started teaching him seriously about handling and breaking horses. One evening, when all 3 children were home for supper, Matthew made an announcement. "I wanted you all to know that I have asked Sarah Mitchell to marry me, and she said yes." The table erupted in excitement. Sarah was the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a sweet girl of 18 who had been friends with Matthew since childhood. Marjorie had suspected for some time that the friendship was turning into something more, but hearing it made official filled her with joy. "When is the wedding?" Marjorie asked. "We thought this fall," Matthew said. "We want to get married before the weather turns cold." "And Mother, Sarah was hoping you would play at the wedding. She said she could not imagine getting married without your music." "I would be honored," Marjorie said, reaching across the table to squeeze her son's hand. The wedding was a joyful affair held at the ranch, just as Daniel and Marjorie's had been. The whole community turned out, and Marjorie played the same waltz that had been her and Daniel's wedding song. As she played, she watched her son dance with his new wife, and she felt the circle of life completing itself. Her son was starting his own family, building his own future, and doing it right here in the place where she and Daniel had built their life together. Over the next few years, Mary also married to a young doctor who had recently set up practice in Winnemucca. They stayed in town, but they visited the ranch frequently, and Mary continued to sing at community events. James, at 16, was already gaining a reputation as one of the best horse trainers in the region, with people coming from all over to have him work with their animals. Daniel and Marjorie, now in their 40s, gradually began to hand over more of the ranch operations to their children and their hired hands. They still worked, but they no longer carried the full burden of keeping everything running. This gave them more time to spend together, to travel occasionally, and to simply enjoy the fruits of all their years of hard labor. On a warm evening in late summer, 25 years after Marjorie had first arrived in Winnemucca, she and Daniel sat on their porch watching the sunset. They had been sitting in these same spots for a quarter of a century, watching the sky turn colors and the stars emerge, and yet it never got old. The land around them was still beautiful, still harsh, still demanding, but it was home in the deepest sense of the word. "Do you remember the day you arrived?" Daniel asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "How could I forget?" Marjorie said with a smile. "I was terrified. I had traveled 3,000 miles to marry a man I had never met, carrying nothing but my fiddle and a small trunk of belongings." "You were the bravest person I had ever met," Daniel said. "Standing there with your fiddle, ready to start a completely new life. I fell in love with you right then, though I did not realize it at the time." "I was not sure what to think of you at first," Marjorie admitted. "You were so nervous, turning your hat around and around in your hands. But you were kind. That was what I noticed most. You were genuinely kind. And you brought music," Daniel said. "That first night when you played from your window at the boarding house, I stood in the street listening, and I knew that you were going to change my life." "We changed each other's lives," Marjorie said. She reached for his hand, and he took it, their fingers interlacing in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. They sat in silence for a while longer, and then Daniel said, "Would you play for me? Our wedding song. I know it has been years, but I would like to hear it again." Marjorie smiled and retrieved her fiddle from where it rested against the wall. The instrument was older now, the wood darkened with age and use, but it still sang sweetly. She lifted it to her shoulder and began to play the waltz, the melody she had played countless times over the years for weddings and dances and quiet evenings at home. Daniel stood and offered his hand, and Marjorie set down the fiddle and took it. They began to dance right there on the porch, moving together with the ease of people who had danced this dance hundreds of times before, who knew each other's movements as well as their own. Matthew arrived just then, riding up from his own ranch with his wife Sarah and their 2 young children. They sat in their wagon watching Daniel and Marjorie dance, and Matthew said to his wife, "That is what I want for us. 25 years from now, I want us to still be dancing together like that." "Then we will be," Sarah said, leaning against his shoulder. Daniel and Marjorie finished their dance and looked up to find their family watching. "Come join us," Marjorie called out. "Let us make this an evening of music and dancing." Matthew brought out his fiddle, and James appeared from the barn with his harmonica. Mary and her husband arrived from town, and soon the porch and yard were filled with family and music and laughter. The children played while the adults danced, and the music floated out across the range island, carried on the evening breeze. As Marjorie played, surrounded by the family she and Daniel had created, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From grief and loss in Boston to hope and new beginnings on a dusty stage in Nevada. From uncertainty and fear to love and belonging. From a young woman clutching a fiddle and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake to a woman of 48 who knew, with absolute certainty, that every hard choice, every scary step, every moment of doubt had been worth it. The sun set in a blaze of color, painting the Nevada sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. The music continued, a celebration of family and love and the life they had all built together in this beautiful, harsh, wonderful land. And as the stars began to emerge overhead, same as they had every night for 25 years, Marjorie Harper played her fiddle and danced with her husband and felt, in her very bones, the truth that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Years continued to pass with the reliable rhythm of seasons. The ranch remained a gathering place for the growing family. Matthew and Sarah had 4 children, and they often brought them to visit their grandparents. Mary and her husband had 3 children, and little James, who was not so little anymore, eventually married a spirited young woman named Catherine who shared his love of horses. They had 2 children who seemed to have inherited their father's adventurous nature. Daniel and Marjorie, now in their late 50s, found themselves in the role of beloved grandparents. The house was often filled with the sounds of children playing and laughing, and Marjorie started teaching the grandchildren to play music just as she had taught their parents. Some showed promise, others just enjoyed making noise, but all of them loved sitting with their grandmother and learning songs. The community of Winnemucca had grown over the years, and the Harper Ranch had become something of a landmark. People spoke of Daniel Harper as one of the founding families, a man who had helped build the town and the region into what it was. And they spoke of Marjorie Harper as the woman who had brought music to Nevada, who had taught generations of children to play, and who still performed at every important community event. On their 30th anniversary, the children organized a surprise celebration at the ranch. They invited everyone Daniel and Marjorie had ever known, it seemed, and the yard was crowded with people who had come to honor the couple. There were speeches and toasts, and person after person stood up to talk about how Daniel and Marjorie had touched their lives. Mrs. Peterson, now in her 80s and frail but still sharp-minded, talked about the nervous young woman who had arrived on the stage 30 years ago. She stood there with that fiddle case clutched to her chest, Mrs. Peterson said, and I thought to myself, that girl is either very brave or very foolish to come all this way to marry a stranger. Turned out she was brave, and we are all better for it. Bill Sanders from the general store, now retired and gray-haired, talked about Daniel's fairness in business and his generosity to the community. Reverend Matthews, who had married them all those years ago and was now quite elderly, spoke about the strength of their commitment and how they had built a marriage that had weathered every storm. And then Matthew stood up with his fiddle, and Mary prepared to sing, and James had his harmonica ready. Our parents taught us many things, Matthew said. How to work hard, how to treat people with respect, how to build a good life. But most importantly, they taught us about love. Real love, the kind that lasts through hard times and good times, the kind that grows deeper with every passing year. And they taught us about music, about how it can bring joy and comfort and connection. So we want to play for them now to thank them. The three children performed together, playing and singing a medley of songs that had meaning to the family. They played the Irish air that had been the first song Marjorie performed in Winnemucca. They played the waltz that was Daniel and Marjorie's wedding song. And they finished with a new song that Matthew had composed, a piece he called The Harper Legacy, which wove together melodies that represented different members of the family. Daniel and Marjorie stood together, hands clasped, tears streaming down their faces as they listened to their children honor them with music. When the performance ended, the crowd erupted in applause, and Daniel pulled Marjorie into his arms. 30 years, he said softly, his lips close to her ear. 30 years, and I love you more now than I did on our wedding day. 30 years of music and love and family, Marjorie said. I could not have asked for a better life. The celebration continued late into the night, with dancing and more music and endless stories being shared. As the evening drew to a close and people began to leave, Marjorie found herself standing alone on the porch for a moment, looking out at the land that had become so familiar over the years. The same stars sparkled overhead. The same wind whispered through the grass. The same sense of vast space and possibility stretched out in all directions. But she was no longer that scared young woman who had arrived clutching her fiddle. She was a wife, a mother, a grandmother. She was a teacher, a musician, a valued member of her community. She was exactly who she was meant to be. Daniel came out to join her, slipping an arm around her waist. They stood together in silence, comfortable with each other in the way that only comes from decades of shared life. No regrets. Daniel asked, echoing a question he had asked many times over the years. Not a single one, Marjorie said, as she always did, and it was true. Every choice, every challenge, every moment of joy and sorrow had led to this, to standing on this porch with this man, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built together. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust and growing things. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out to the moon. The ranch settled into nighttime quiet, secure and peaceful, and in that moment, Marjorie Harper knew that she had found what everyone searches for, a place to belong, people to love, and a purpose that gave meaning to her days. She had brought her fiddle to the Wild West, and a cowboy had asked her to play their wedding song. From that simple beginning, they had built something beautiful and lasting, a legacy of love and music that would continue long after they were gone. The years mellowed into a gentle rhythm of seasons and celebrations. Daniel and Marjorie, now in their 60s, had stepped back from most ranch operations but remained active in the community. Marjorie still taught music lessons, though fewer now, and she performed at special occasions. Daniel served on the town council and advised younger ranchers who sought his wisdom. Their children had built successful lives of their own but remained close to home and to each other. The grandchildren, now numbering 11 in total, were a constant source of joy and energy. Every Sunday, the whole extended family gathered at the ranch for dinner, a tradition that had been maintained for decades. On one such Sunday, when the house and yard were full of family, Marjorie sat on the porch watching the scene before her. Children ran and played while adults talked and laughed. The smell of roasting meat drifted from the kitchen where several daughters-in-law were finishing preparations for the meal. It was a scene of contentment and belonging, everything she had hoped for when she made that terrifying journey west so many years ago. Daniel came to sit beside her, moving a little more slowly than he once had but still strong and vital. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how far we have come," Marjorie said. "About how this all started with letters between strangers and grew into this." She gestured at the family gathered around them. "Best letters I ever wrote," Daniel said with a smile. Matthew approached the porch with several of his older children. The eldest, a boy of 17 named Daniel after his grandfather, carried a fiddle case. "Grandfather, grandmother," Matthew said, "Daniel has something he wants to show you." Young Daniel looked nervous but determined. He opened the case and brought out a fiddle, then launched into a complex piece that Marjorie had been working on with him for months. His playing was confident and skilled, showing real mastery of the instrument. When he finished, everyone burst into applause. "That was excellent," Marjorie said, her heart swelling with pride. "You have worked so hard and it shows." "I want to be as good as you someday, grandmother," young Daniel said. "I want to play like you do, where the music just flows and makes everyone feel something." "You are well on your way," Marjorie assured him. "And I think you might even surpass me one day. You have natural talent and the dedication to develop it." The family gathered for the meal, crowding around tables that had been set up in the yard. As was tradition, they joined hands while Daniel said grace, thanking God for the food for the family and for the many blessings they had received. Then the meal began, with food and conversation flowing freely. Later, as the sun began its descent, someone called for music. Marjorie retrieved her fiddle, now an old friend of more than 40 years, and several of the grandchildren brought out their own instruments. They played together, multiple generations making music under the Nevada sky, and Daniel watched his wife with the same wonder and love he had felt on that first day when she had played from her window at the boarding house. The music drew neighbors from surrounding ranches, as it often did. People came on horseback and in wagons, drawn by the sound of fiddles and harmonicas and voices raised in song. It became an impromptu party, with dancing in the yard and children darting between the adults. As full dark fell and someone lit lanterns, Daniel found Marjorie taking a brief rest. He held out his hand and said, as he had said so many times over the years, "May I have this dance?" She took his hand, and they moved together to music being played by their children and grandchildren. Around them, other couples danced, but Daniel and Marjorie were in their own world, moving together with the practiced ease of people who had danced together for more than 3 decades. "Play our wedding song tonight," Daniel said softly, echoing the request he had made on their wedding night all those years ago. When their dance ended, Marjorie gathered the musicians and announced, "My husband has requested our wedding song." She lifted her fiddle and began to play the waltz, the same melody she had played countless times but which never lost its power or meaning. Other instruments joined in, creating a rich, full sound that carried across the rangeland. Couples danced, including Matthew and Sarah, Mary and her husband, James and Catherine. 3 generations of Harpers moved together under the stars, connected by love and family, and the music that Marjorie had brought to this place so long ago. When the song ended, young Daniel, who had been watching intently, said, "Tell us the story, grandmother. Tell us about the day you arrived in Winnemucca." It was a story the grandchildren had heard many times, but they never tired of it. Marjorie settled into a chair while the children gathered around her feet, and she told the tale once more, about leaving Boston, about the long journey west, about stepping off the stage with nothing but her fiddle and her courage, about meeting Daniel for the first time and not knowing if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the best decision she would ever make. "I was so scared," she told them, "but I was also hopeful. And your grandfather, he was so kind and patient. He gave me time to decide if I wanted to stay, never pressuring me, never making me feel like I had to do anything I was not ready for. "And then you fell in love," one of the younger grandchildren said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "And then we fell in love," Marjorie agreed, smiling at Daniel. "Not all at once like in fairy tales, but gradually, day by day, as we learned about each other and built a life together." "And you brought music," young Daniel said. "You brought music to Nevada." "I brought my fiddle," Marjorie corrected gently. The music was already here, in the wind and the birds and the hearts of the people. I just helped give it a voice. The gathering eventually broke up, with neighbors heading home and family members settling children into wagons for the ride back to their own ranches. Matthew lingered after the others had left, helping to clean up and put things in order. "Thank you for keeping the tradition going," Daniel told his son. "These Sunday gatherings, they mean everything to your mother and me." "They mean everything to all of us," Matthew said. "This is where we all come from, where our roots are. These Sunday dinners, they remind us who we are and where we belong." After Matthew left, Daniel and Marjorie stood on the porch one last time, looking out at the familiar landscape bathed in starlight. Marjorie leaned against her husband, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness that had been her anchor for so many years. "I could not have imagined this," she said softly. "When I was on that stage, traveling across the country, I could not have imagined that I would find all of this." "I am grateful every day that you took the chance," Daniel said. "That you were brave enough to come here to give us a chance." "Best decision I ever made," Marjorie said, echoing his earlier sentiment about the letters. They went inside together, to the house that had sheltered them through decades of joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. The house where they had raised their children, where they had laughed and cried and loved each other through all the ups and downs of life. The house that was not just a structure of wood and stone, but a home in the truest sense, filled with memories and love, and the echo of countless songs played on a fiddle brought from Boston by a brave young woman seeking a new beginning. The next morning, Marjorie woke to find Daniel already up and standing at the window, looking out at the sunrise. She joined him, slipping her hand into his. "It never gets old," Daniel said, watching the sky turn from gray to pink to gold. 40 years I have been watching the sun rise over this land, and it never gets old." "Nothing about this life has gotten old," Marjorie said. "Sometimes I think about my life in Boston, the person I was then, and it feels like a different lifetime, like it happened to someone else." "In a way it did," Daniel said. "You became someone new when you came here. We both did. We became the people we were meant to be." They spent that day working on small projects around the ranch, moving slowly but steadily. Daniel checked on some repairs to the barn. Marjorie worked in her garden, tending to the vegetables and herbs she grew every year. They had lunch together on the porch, and afterward, Marjorie picked up her fiddle and played softly while Daniel dozed in his chair. That evening, as the sun began to set, they heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Mary appeared with her youngest daughter, Emma, who was 10 years old and showing real promise on the fiddle. "I hope you do not mind us dropping by," Mary said. "But Emma has been working on a new piece and she wanted to play it for you." "We never mind," Marjorie assured her daughter. "You know you are always welcome." Emma, nervous but excited, played a complicated piece that Marjorie recognized as one of her father's old tunes, the Irish air she had played on her first day in Winnemucca. The girl's playing was still rough in places, but there was feeling in it, a connection to the music that could not be taught, only nurtured. When Emma finished, Marjorie pulled her into a hug. "That was beautiful," she said. "Your great-grandfather would have been so proud to hear his song played with such heart." "Will you play it with me?" Emma asked hopefully. I want to hear how it is supposed to sound." Marjorie picked up her own fiddle, and she and Emma played the tune together, grandmother and great-granddaughter making music that spanned generations. Daniel and Mary watched, both of them moved by the sight and sound of this legacy being passed down. After Mary and Emma left, Daniel said, "I love watching you teach the children. You have such patience with them, such joy in sharing what you know." "Music is meant to be shared," Marjorie said. "It is too beautiful, too powerful to keep to yourself." "My father taught me that, and I am trying to pass it on to the next generations." "You have done more than that," Daniel said. "You have created a legacy. When we are gone, your music will still be here, in the children and grandchildren you have taught, in the songs you have shared." That is immortality of a sort. Time continued its inexorable forward motion. Daniel and Marjorie celebrated their 40th anniversary surrounded by their large extended family. They were in their 70s now, moving more slowly and tiring more easily, but still active and engaged with life. Daniel still gave advice to younger ranchers, though he had officially turned over all operations to Matthew and James, who ran the ranch as partners. Marjorie still taught music, though now she mostly worked with her great-grandchildren, passing on the skills and love of music that had defined so much of her life. One day, about 6 months after their 40th anniversary, Daniel complained of pain in his chest. Marjorie, alarmed, sent James to fetch the doctor. The diagnosis was serious. Daniel's heart was failing. The doctor was honest about the prognosis. Daniel likely had months, perhaps a year, but his time was limited. The family rallied around them. Matthew, Mary, and James all came to stay at the ranch for an extended period, bringing their own families. The house was constantly full, but neither Daniel nor Marjorie minded. They were surrounded by love, by the evidence of the life they had built together. Daniel remained cheerful despite his declining health. "I've had a good life," he told Marjorie one evening as they sat on the porch, his favorite place. "No man could ask for more than what I have had. A good woman who loved me, fine children, a successful ranch, a place I could call home. I am not afraid of what comes next. I am afraid," Marjorie admitted, her voice breaking. "I am afraid of being without you." "You will never be without me," Daniel said, taking her hand. "I will be in every sunset you watch from this porch. I will be in the music you play. I will be in our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. A love like ours does not end just because one of us moves on to whatever comes next." That evening, Marjorie played for Daniel soft, gentle melodies that soothed and comforted. He listened with his eyes closed, a small smile on his face, holding her free hand while the music washed over them both. Over the following weeks, as Daniel grew weaker, the family made sure someone was always with him. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren took turns sitting with their grandfather, listening to his stories, holding his hand. It was a time of sadness but also of connection, of family coming together to honor a man who had meant so much to all of them. One evening in late autumn, when the air had turned cool and the cottonwoods were dropping their leaves, Daniel asked Marjorie to play for him one more time. The family gathered in and around the bedroom, and Marjorie, tears streaming down her face, played their wedding song, the waltz they had danced to so many times over the years. When she finished, Daniel smiled at her and said, "That was perfect. Everything about our life together has been perfect." And then, surrounded by his family, holding Marjorie's hand, Daniel Harper closed his eyes and slipped peacefully away. The grief was overwhelming. Marjorie felt as if part of herself had been torn away, as if she were missing a limb or had lost one of her senses. They had been partners for 40 years, had faced everything together, and the idea of going forward without him seemed impossible. The funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire county. People came from ranches and towns throughout the region to pay their respects to a man who had been a pillar of the community. Reverend Matthews, now ancient himself, spoke about Daniel's integrity, his kindness, his dedication to his family and community. Matthew spoke about his father's example, about the lessons Daniel had taught through his actions rather than just his words, and Marjorie played. Despite her grief, or perhaps because of it, she played her fiddle at Daniel's funeral, played the songs he had loved, including the waltz one final time. Her fingers trembled on the strings, and tears blurred her vision, but she played because it was what Daniel would have wanted, because music had always been her way of expressing what words could not capture. In the days and weeks after the funeral, Marjorie struggled. The house felt empty without Daniel, even when it was filled with family. The ranch looked different without him walking its paths and checking on the animals. Everything reminded her of him, and the grief threatened to swallow her whole. But slowly, with the support of her children and the passage of time, Marjorie began to find her way forward. She realized that Daniel had been right. He was still with her, in the sunset from the porch, in the music she played, in the faces and mannerisms of their children. He was woven into the fabric of her life so completely that he could never truly be gone. She threw herself into her music with renewed dedication. She taught more lessons, performed more often, and even began composing her own pieces, melodies that expressed her grief and her love and her gratitude for the life she had been given. One of these compositions, which she called Daniel's Song, became popular throughout the region. People requested it at weddings and celebrations, and it became known as a song about enduring love, about partnership and commitment and building a life together. Marjorie lived for another 10 years after Daniel's passing, years that were not without their own joys. She watched more great-grandchildren be born and begin to grow. She taught several of them to play music. She attended weddings and celebrations. She remained an active part of her family and community, but she never stopped missing Daniel. Every evening, she sat on the porch and watched the sunset, just as they had done together for so many years. And often, she would play their wedding song, the waltz that had been theirs alone, playing for an audience of one who she believed was listening from wherever he had gone. On a warm evening in early summer, when Marjorie was 83 years old, she sat on the porch playing her fiddle while surrounded by several of her great-grandchildren. She had been teaching them a new song, and they were laughing and making mistakes and trying again, the way children do. When the lesson was over and the children had been called away by their parents, Marjorie sat alone on the porch, her fiddle on her lap, watching the sun set in shades of gold and crimson. She felt tired but content, ready for whatever came next. That night, Marjorie Harper passed away peacefully in her sleep, in the house she and Daniel had shared, in the bed they had slept in together for 40 years. She was found the next morning by Mary, who had come for a visit, with a small smile on her face and her fiddle case beside the bed. The funeral was, if anything, even larger than Daniel's had been. Marjorie had touched so many lives through her music and her teaching that people came from all over Nevada and even from neighboring states to pay their respects. The church could not hold everyone, so the service was held outdoors, just as her wedding had been, at the ranch she and Daniel had built together. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren all spoke about what she had meant to them, about the lessons she had taught, and the love she had given. And then, following a tradition that seemed only fitting, young Daniel, now a man of 27 and an accomplished musician himself, played his great-grandmother's fiddle and performed the waltz that had been Daniel and Marjorie's wedding song. As the music flowed across the rangeland, carried on the summer breeze, people whispered that they could almost see them. Daniel and Marjorie, young again, dancing together under the Nevada sky, reunited at last in whatever comes after this life. Marjorie Harper was buried beside her husband on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a vast sky that stretched from horizon to horizon. Their graves were marked with simple headstones that bore their names, the years of their lives, and a single line: they brought music to the desert and raised a family in love. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through the generations, and it became a tradition that every Sunday the family gathered there for dinner, just as they had when Daniel and Marjorie were alive. And almost always, there was music, with multiple generations playing together, keeping alive the tradition that a brave young woman had started when she stepped off a stage in Winnemucca clutching nothing but her fiddle and her courage. The story of Daniel and Marjorie Harper became something of a legend in Nevada, a tale told to illustrate what could be built through courage, love, and dedication. People spoke of the mail-order bride who brought her fiddle and the cowboy who asked her to play their wedding song, and how from that simple beginning they had created something beautiful and lasting. Years turned into decades, and the world changed around the ranch. Winnemucca grew from a frontier town into a modern city. Cars replaced horses on most roads. Electricity and telephones and all the conveniences of the 20th century came to even the most remote ranches. But through it all, the Harper Ranch remained, a connection to the past and a reminder of what really matters: family, love, and the courage to build something meaningful. And whenever the family gathered, whenever there was music played on that porch or in that yard, people swore they could feel something special in the air, as if Daniel and Marjorie's love had soaked into the very soil and wood and stone of the place, making it more than just a ranch but a testament to the power of love and music and partnership. The fiddle that Marjorie had brought from Boston remained in the family, passed down through the generations to whoever showed the most promise and dedication. It was played at every important family event, at weddings and funerals and celebrations, its voice still clear and true after more than a century of use. And so the legacy continued, generation after generation, each building on what had come before, each adding their own chapter to a story that had begun with a scared young woman and a hopeful man meeting for the first time in a dusty Nevada town in 1882. It was a story of love found and families built, of music shared and traditions maintained, of two people who had taken a chance on each other and created something that would outlast them both by many years. In the end, that is what endures. Not wealth or fame or power, but love and the connections we make with other people, the families we build and the traditions we pass down. Daniel and Marjorie Harper had understood this, had lived it every day of their 40 years together, and had created a legacy that would continue for as long as there were Harpers gathering on that ranch, making music under the Nevada sky, remembering and honoring the courage and love that had started it all.